In 1903, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans was excavating the ruins of the Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete when he uncovered something that stopped him in his tracks. It was a small figurine, about 30 centimeters tall, made of painted faience. She held a snake in each hand and wore an elaborate layered skirt. Her tight-fitting bodice was completely open at the front, leaving her breasts fully exposed. Evans named her the Snake Goddess, and she was approximately 3,500 years old. What nobody expected was that this ancient figurine would rewrite what historians believed they knew about the history of underwear. Because the question of what women wore before bras isn't just a question about fabric, it's a story about power, pain, revolution, and one very stubborn corset that took 4 centuries to kill. Around 1600 BCE, the Minoan civilization on the Mediterranean island of Crete was at its peak, and its approach to women's clothing was unlike anything that would follow in the Western world for thousands of years. Those snake goddess figurines from the Palace of Knossos weren't wearing their open bodices by accident. Minoan women wore tight-fitting garments that deliberately lifted and framed the breasts while leaving them completely uncovered. These weren't undergarments, they were outerwear. Walking around the palace, attending ceremonies, or simply going about daily life dressed this way was perfectly normal. Breasts weren't something to hide. They were symbols of fertility, divine power, and social status. The tighter the bodice, the more prominent the display, and the higher the woman's rank. And this wasn't some obscure historical footnote. Wall paintings throughout Minoan palaces depict groups of women dressed in exactly the same fashion. It was the standard style of an entire civilization, which makes what happened next in history feel like one very long overcorrection. Because when we move forward to ancient Greece, nearly 1,000 years later, the entire philosophy changes. Greek women wrapped bands of wool or linen across their chests, tying or pinning them at the back. These garments were known by different names depending on the period and the city-state. The apodesmos, the strophion, the mastodesmos, and the mastodoton. They all essentially meant the same thing, breastband. And they all served the same purpose: flatten, compress, contain. In Homer's Iliad, one of the oldest works of Western literature, the goddess Aphrodite removes a curiously embroidered girdle from her chest. That passage was written around 750 BCE, meaning the breastband was already ancient enough by then to appear in mythology. Later, in Aristophanes' comedy Lysistrata, written around 411 BCE, a woman teases her husband by slowly removing her strophion as part of a sex strike during the Peloponnesian War. These breastbands weren't merely practical garments, they had become part of the cultural language of attraction, modesty, and even political power. But Greece's goal was completely different from that of the Minoans. It wasn't about display, it was about restraint. A bound chest was a respectable chest. Young Spartan women even wore breastbands during athletic training, but the emphasis remained on control rather than presentation. The Minoan philosophy of lifting and framing the breasts had disappeared entirely. In its place emerged an idea that would echo throughout Western history for the next 2,000 years. The female body was something that needed to be managed. Rome inherited much of Greece's thinking, but approached it with greater variety and considerably more practicality. Roman women had several options depending on the occasion. The strophium was a bandeau-style linen garment wrapped snugly around the chest, similar to what we'd call a tube top today. For everyday wear, there was the mammillare, a softer binding cloth designed to flatten the chest beneath a tunic. And for physical exercise, there was something remarkably close to what we'd recognize today as a sports bra. One of the most famous pieces of evidence comes from the Villa Romana del Casale in Sicily, an enormous Roman estate dating to the early 4th century. The floor of one room is covered with a mosaic depicting women competing in athletic events, throwing the discus, lifting weights, playing ball games, and even receiving victory crowns. Every one of them is wearing what looks strikingly similar to a modern bikini top and bottom. Historians refer to them as the Bikini Girls, and the image is so remarkable that when it was first excavated in the early 20th century, some scholars refused to believe it could genuinely be ancient. It was. These women were elite athletes, and their breast support was designed for movement, not simply for modesty. The stitching and structure visible in the mosaic suggest garments that were carefully cut and sewn to fit, rather than simple strips of cloth wrapped around the chest. According to classicist Jan Radica, Roman women appear to have owned multiple breast garments for different purposes. Unfortunately, the surviving evidence is frustratingly incomplete. We know these garments existed. We can see them in art. What we can't say with certainty is exactly what they looked like in 3 dimensions, because almost none of them have survived. In the next part, the story moves across India and China before revealing the remarkable medieval discovery at Austria's Lengberg castle, a discovery that completely reshaped historians' understanding of the bra's history. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the same instinct was emerging independently. Indian texts from roughly the same period describe women wearing similar garments. A Sanskrit play from the 4th century mentions the heroine wearing a breastcloth, which she uses as a dramatic prop, much like the strophions seen in Lysistrata. In Ming Dynasty China, between 1368 and 1644, women achieved the fashionable look of a flattened chest by wearing a dudou, a diamond-shaped cloth garment that compressed the breasts while also protecting the stomach. The dudou wasn't designed for support. It was created to achieve a particular aesthetic, one that favored a smooth, flat silhouette over pronounced curves. The important point is this. Across multiple continents and over thousands of years, human societies independently reached the same conclusion. Once breasts are subjected to gravity and movement, they benefit from some form of support or management. The methods vary dramatically depending on the culture, the era, and prevailing ideas about how a woman's body should look. But the instinct to do something was nearly universal. Now, this is where the story takes a genuinely unexpected turn. For centuries, historians believed that the modern bra was essentially invented in the late 1800s. Before then, the common assumption was that medieval European women either wore no breast support at all or relied entirely on rigid corsets. There was supposedly no middle ground. Then, during the summer of 2008, construction workers renovating Lengberg Castle in the mountains of East Tyrol, Austria, broke through a wall and uncovered a sealed vault that had remained hidden for more than 500 years. Inside, packed between the floors as insulation during a 15th century renovation ordered by the Austrian noble Virgil von Graben, were more than 2,700 textile fragments. There were leather shoes, scraps of silk and wool, more than 200 coins, 160 handmade playing cards, bone fragments, pottery shards, and 4 seemingly ordinary pieces of linen that caused archaeologists from the University of Innsbruck to stop and stare. Because these fragments, preserved almost perfectly by the dry conditions inside the sealed vault, looked astonishingly similar to modern bras. Not breastbands, not simple wrappings, actual bras. They had distinct, separately cut cups. The lead researcher, Beatrix Nutz, was skeptical at first. Nobody had ever discovered physical evidence of medieval bras with individually sewn cups. There had been scattered written references throughout European literature. A 15th century chronicle from Thuringia, written by Conrad Stoller, mentioned women's shirts that had bags in which they put their breasts. Stoller, clearly unimpressed, concluded that such garments were, and this is a direct translation, all indecent. Other medieval texts referred to breast bags or bands used to bind large breasts, but none clearly described structured cups. Without physical evidence, most historians assumed those references were exaggerations, misunderstandings, or simply poor descriptions. Until Lengberg. Fiber samples were sent to the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich for carbon-14 dating. To everyone's surprise, the results confirmed the discovery. These linen bras genuinely dated back to the 15th century. One of them is remarkably similar to a 1950s long-line bra. It features two cups made from separate pieces of linen sewn together vertically, a band extending down to the ribcage, eyelets for lacing, and delicate decorative needle lace around the cups. 500 years ago, someone carefully crafted a piece of underwear that Victoria's Secret would instantly recognize. The discovery completely reshaped the historical timeline, but it also created a new mystery. If medieval women had already developed something so similar to the modern bra, why did the technology disappear? Why did the Western world spend the next 4 centuries squeezing women into whalebone corsets instead? The answer has a name: Catherine de' Medici. When Catherine arrived in France from Italy in the mid-1500s as the wife of King Henry II, she brought with her a style that would dominate European women's fashion for the next 3.5 centuries: the corset, or, as it was known at the time, the body. Catherine's version was a long, tightly fitted bodice worn beneath clothing. It was stiffened with layers of fabric and glue and reinforced with a busk. A busk was a long, flat piece of whalebone or wood carved into a knife-like shape and inserted into the front of the garment. Later versions would use steel. The goal was to create a completely rigid torso, eliminate any visible curve at the waist, and push the bust upward into a shelf-like silhouette. Ladies of the French court considered the corset absolutely essential to feminine beauty, and in Catherine's court, a 13-inch waist was regarded as the ideal. Think about that for a moment. 13 inches. That's roughly the circumference of a large cantaloupe. To achieve it, women laced their corsets so tightly that their floating ribs were forced inward, while their internal organs were physically displaced. Contemporary accounts even describe mothers laying their daughters on the floor and placing a foot on their backs to gain enough leverage to tighten the stays. At the time, this was considered good parenting. By the beginning of the 17th century, corsets were everywhere. They were constructed from linen and bone, reinforced with reeds and whalebone, and laced together with hemp or linen thread. Queen Elizabeth I wore them. French courtesans wore them. Working women in the English countryside wore them. A Swiss traveller visiting England in 1745 observed that even women in rural villages all go laced, because loose stays were believed to indicate loose morals. Wearing a corset wasn't simply a fashion choice, it was considered a statement about a woman's character. An unlaced waist suggested a woman who couldn't be trusted. During the 18th century, corsets became even more extreme. Some were made from a tough species of leather called bend, nearly 1/4 of an inch thick, more like shoe leather than clothing. Others incorporated steel rods running the full length of the torso. The ideal shape changed with fashion. One decade favored a conical torso with a flattened bust. The next demanded exaggerated curves with the bust pushed as high as possible. But one thing never changed: rigidity. The female body, left to its natural form, was considered unacceptable. It had to be molded. The Victorian era took this obsession to an entirely new level. Beginning in the 1830s, the hourglass silhouette became the dominant ideal, and corsets were specifically engineered to make the waist appear dramatically smaller than the hips. They were reinforced with whalebone, steel, or reed. The front remained flat, the back curved, and the practice of tight lacing developed into a culture of its own. Women exchanged advice in magazines about achieving ever smaller waist measurements. Some even slept in their corsets, hoping to gradually train their waists into shape. Children began wearing them as young as 3 or 4 years old. Pregnant women wore specially modified versions because appearing visibly pregnant in public was considered scandalous. There were even corsets designed specifically for men, marketed to fashionable 19th century dandies who desired a slimmer silhouette. The health consequences were very real, and they could be severe. Did women actually faint because of corsets? Yes, some certainly did. Tight lacing restricted breathing, impaired digestion, and, over time, could contribute to deformities of the ribs and spine. Internal organs were compressed and displaced. In extreme cases, the liver even developed grooves from years of constant pressure against the lower ribs. Doctors documented the condition and referred to it as corset liver. Medical reports also described fractured ribs, collapsed lungs, and restricted blood circulation to the lower body. But this is where historians urge caution. The most extreme cases were genuine, but they were not the norm. Most women wore their corsets at moderate tension and lived perfectly active, functional lives. The popular image of every Victorian woman constantly gasping for air owes much to dress reformers, who exaggerated the dangers to strengthen their arguments, and to modern films that love dramatic fainting scenes. As is so often the case, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Corsets were uncomfortable. They were restrictive. When laced too tightly, they could absolutely cause serious harm. But they were not the medieval torture devices that popular culture often portrays them as. By the 1870s, however, a rebellion had begun. Women involved in the dress reform movement started calling for the complete abolition of the corset. In Britain, the Rational Dress Society was founded in 1881 with the explicit goal of promoting clothing that neither deformed the figure nor restricted the body's natural movement. They published pamphlets. They organized public lectures. They even designed alternative garments that shifted weight onto the shoulders instead of crushing the waist. Across the Atlantic, American novelist Elizabeth Stuart Phelps Ward voiced the same frustration. In 1873, she wrote words that sound as though they could have appeared on a protest sign a century later. She urged women to burn their corsets, to throw the cruel steels that had lorded it over your thorax and abdomens for so many years into a bonfire and never look back. She called it emancipation. She insisted women would never again need whalebones, but corsets refused to disappear. They carried too much cultural momentum, too much moral significance, and too many manufacturers depended on them for profit. The Edwardian era even introduced a supposed improvement, the S-bend corset. Designed by a physician who believed it was healthier, this version pushed the bust forward and the hips backward instead of aggressively cinching the waist. The result was a posture that made women appear as though they were constantly leaning forward, perpetually on the verge of tipping over. It was advertised as the healthy alternative. It wasn't. It would ultimately take a Parisian seamstress who had once fought on the barricades, a teenage socialite armed with 2 silk handkerchiefs, and one of the deadliest wars in human history, to finally bring the corset's 4-century reign to an end. If you've made it this far, do me a favor and hit subscribe. I cover fascinating stories from history like this every week, and there's always another strange chapter waiting to be uncovered. The woman who fired the first truly successful shot against the corset was born in Paris in 1845. Her name was Herminie Cadolle, although she was born Eugénie Sardon. She was a corsetier by trade, a skilled seamstress who made the very garments she would eventually help replace. But Cadolle was far more than a seamstress. She was also a committed political activist. In 1871, during the Paris Commune, she fought alongside Louise Michel, one of the best-known anarchists in French history. The Commune was a radical workers' government that controlled Paris for 72 days before being violently crushed by the French army. Cadolle joined the Union of Women for the Defense of Paris and Care of the Wounded, one of Europe's earliest organized feminist movements. When the Commune collapsed and its supporters were hunted, imprisoned, deported, or executed, Cadolle managed to escape. She eventually settled in Buenos Aires with her family, where she opened a shop specializing in made-to-measure lingerie. She was exceptionally good at it. The business prospered, and she built a considerable fortune. Nearly 20 years later, she returned to Paris carrying both a successful business and a deep dislike for corsets. She also had an idea that would outlive every government she had ever fought for. In 1889, the same year the Eiffel Tower made its debut on the Paris skyline, Herminie Cadolle unveiled her invention at the Universal Exposition. She had taken the traditional corset and done something brilliantly simple. She cut it in half. The lower portion remained a corset that supported the waist. The upper portion became something entirely new. Instead of forcing the breasts upward with rigid boning from below, it supported them using 2 boned cups and shoulder straps. She called the design the corselet gorge and marketed it under the commercial name le bien-être, meaning well-being. For all practical purposes, it was the direct ancestor of every modern bra hanging in closets around the world today. But there was one problem. It failed. Women in the 1890s still wanted impossibly tiny waists, and only a full corset could create that fashionable silhouette. Cadolle's invention was simply ahead of its time by about 20 years. Even so, she continued selling it to a select clientele. By 1905, she had begun offering the upper portion of her designs separately under the name soutien-gorge, which literally translates as throat support. In older French, however, gorge also meant breast. To this day, soutien-gorge remains the French word for bra. And Cadolle's lingerie house? It still exists. More than a century later, it remains family-owned and continues operating in Paris. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in New York, other inventors were trying to solve the same problem. In 1893, a woman named Marie Tussac patented a garment she called a breast supporter. It featured separate pockets for each breast, shoulder straps, and hook and eye closures. It even included a curved metal plate covered in silk or canvas, shaped to fit comfortably against the torso. Remarkably, it looked very much like a modern push-up bra. Unfortunately, Tussac never succeeded in bringing it to market, and her patent quietly faded into obscurity. Then came the woman who would eventually receive most of the credit, even though she wasn't technically the first. Her name was Mary Phelps Jacob. She was a 19-year-old socialite from one of New York's oldest colonial families. As a child, she had been photographed by Charles Dana Gibson, the illustrator famous for creating the iconic Gibson Girl. She attended Rosemary Hall Preparatory School. She was even presented to the King of England during a garden party. By every measure, Mary Phelps Jacob embodied old money American aristocracy, but she absolutely hated corsets. In 1910, she purchased a sheer evening gown for a debutante ball. When she tried it on with the standard whalebone corset, the only socially acceptable undergarment for women of her class, she immediately ran into a problem. The rigid whalebone showed clearly through the gown's sheer fabric and plunging neckline. Later, she described the corset as a box-like armor of whalebone and pink cordage. It completely ruined the look of the dress. So, she did something wonderfully simple. She called for her maid and asked for 2 silk handkerchiefs and some pink ribbon. Together, they stitched and tied the materials into a lightweight garment that supported her breasts, separated them naturally, and disappeared completely beneath the gown. At the ball, other women noticed immediately. They wanted one too. Soon afterward, a complete stranger mailed her $1, asking if she would make another. In 1910, $1 was a meaningful amount of money. Jacob realized she might have accidentally created a business opportunity. On November 3, 1914, the United States Patent Office granted her patent number 1,115,674A for the backless brassiere. She founded the Fashion Form Brassiere Company, opened a small 2-woman factory in Boston, and began attempting to sell the design to department stores. The business never truly gained momentum. Her second husband, the wealthy Bostonian Harry Crosby, eventually persuaded her to shut it down. She sold the patent to the Warner Brothers Corset Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut, for $1,500. Today, that would equal roughly $29,000. Warner Brothers went on to earn more than $15 million from that same patent over the following 30 years. Jacob, who later reinvented herself as Caresse Crosby and became a celebrated literary publisher in Paris, reflected on her invention with characteristic modesty. She once remarked, "I can't say the brassiere will ever take as great a place in history as the steamboat, but I did invent it." Ironically, however, the final blow against the corset didn't come from fashion, it came from war. In 1917, the United States War Industries Board issued an official request asking American women to stop buying corsets. The reason had nothing to do with comfort or women's health. The military needed the metal. Whalebone and steel boning had become strategic wartime resources, and every corset worn by a civilian represented steel that could instead be used to build ships and military equipment. American women responded. The amount of metal saved was extraordinary, an estimated 28,000 tons, enough to construct 2 full battleships. The corset industry, which had dominated women's fashion for nearly 4 centuries, never fully recovered. World War I did more than reduce corset production. It transformed women's lives. For the first time on a massive scale, women entered factories, wore uniforms, and performed physically demanding labor. You simply couldn't operate heavy machinery while confined inside a rigid cage of whalebone and steel. Women needed undergarments that allowed them to move, to breathe, and to work. The bra wasn't merely a fashion innovation, it had become a wartime necessity. The 1920s finally sealed the corset's fate, but not in the way you might expect. Flappers weren't looking for lift or cleavage, they wanted exactly the opposite. The ideal silhouette of the Roaring Twenties was flat, boyish, and androgynous. Bras were redesigned to compress and flatten the chest rather than support it. Bandage-style flattener bras became the defining fashion of the decade. One company, Boyish Form, even marketed a bra specifically designed to make the bust disappear almost entirely. After 4 centuries of corsets pushing breasts upward and outward, fashion had swung dramatically to the opposite extreme. But the most significant innovation of the era came from a Russian immigrant named Ida Rosenthal. She noticed something that seems obvious today, yet no one had seriously addressed before. A bra that fit one woman wouldn't necessarily fit another woman of the same general size. Bodies were different. Breasts varied in size and shape. You couldn't simply manufacture one standard bandeau and expect it to work for everyone. Together with her husband, William Rosenthal, she founded Maidenform and introduced the first standardized cup sizing system. Women were grouped according to bust measurements, allowing different bras to be designed for different body types and different stages of life. During the 1930s, the S.H. Camp and Company refined the concept even further, introducing the letter-based cup sizing system, A through D, that still serves as the foundation of bra sizing around the world today. From that point forward, the bra continued to evolve. Underwire designs first appeared during the 1930s, although they didn't become widely popular until after World War II, when metal once again became readily available for civilian manufacturing. The iconic bullet bra of the 1950s, with its sharply conical silhouette, became one of the defining fashion statements of the decade, thanks in large part to Hollywood stars. Then came the 1960s, and suddenly the bra represented something far bigger than clothing. It became a political symbol. Many feminists argued that the bra, much like the corset before it, represented a tool of male expectations imposed upon women's bodies. It was during this period that the phrase bra burning entered popular culture. Ironically, the famous 1968 protest at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City never actually involved burning bras. Instead, demonstrators threw bras, girdles, high heels, and other symbols of restrictive femininity into what they called a freedom trash can. No one lit a match. The phrase originated only because a reporter compared the protest to Vietnam War draft card burnings. The comparison caught on. The myth endured. From 2 silk handkerchiefs stitched together in a Manhattan bedroom to a global lingerie industry worth more than $90 billion each year. From the snake goddess with her uncovered breasts in Bronze Age Crete to medieval breast bags hidden for 5 centuries inside the walls of an Austrian castle. From Catherine de' Medici's 13-inch waist to Herminie Cadolle, a former communard slicing the corset in half beneath the newly completed Eiffel Tower. The history of what women wore before the bra isn't really a story about underwear. It's a story about what different societies believed women's bodies should look like, who had the authority to decide, and what happened when women finally began making that decision for themselves. Every era had its own answer. Lift them, flatten them, bind them, free them, shape them into cones, stuff them into bags. Each generation believed with complete confidence that its solution was the correct one, and every generation was eventually replaced by the next. Today, the Minoan snake goddess still stands on display at the Heraclean Archaeological Museum on the island of Crete. She is 3,500 years old. She stands roughly 30 centimeters tall. A serpent rests in each hand. Her fitted bodice remains wide open at the front. Her breasts are fully exposed to every visitor who enters the gallery. She was created by a civilization that saw absolutely nothing unusual about that. She has outlasted every breastband, every corset, every whalebone busk, and every 13-inch waist that followed. And after all these centuries, she still looks completely unbothered. If you found this story fascinating, the video on your screen right now dives even deeper into the strange and surprising history you were probably never taught in school. Go ahead, click it.